Welcome back for our afternoon session with guest Ashish Kothari, who is here with us now. And thank you for most of you who stayed back. That's great to see. Like I was just telling Ashish that we've got about 40 students, so we've got a few distant students who will be listening to this online. So I'm recording this for them. Hello, Ashish. Great to have you join us. And I'm just going to quickly introduce you as best as I can, and then we'll move on. Ashish has been active in the field of sustainability globally for as long as I've been alive, which is about close to 40 years. So there's a wealth of experience there. And Ashish is also, wide-ranging in terms of the stuff he has done over the years. One interesting thing to note, especially given that we are in UTAS, is Ashish has co-authored a book on protected area management, which is a textbook on protected area management, along with Michael Lockwood and Graham Warby, who's just recently passed away. Yeah, did you hear that, Ashish?
Graham passed away?
Yep, recently.
Oh, no, I didn't. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, he had cancer for some time.
Just 2 weeks
Oh, that's
ago.
very sad. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Oh.
So Ashish was involved in the textbook. You'd still be using the textbook if you're doing protected area management with Venice now. So that's a bit of a history there. But apart from that, his work on sustainability ranges from local initiatives, empowering local communities, and also looking at democracies and how we can reimagine democracies and how they work. He's written a number of books over the years, and I came across this work after reading this book, Churning the Earth, which I proudly have a copy here with me. And I've used some of the material from the book as part of the weekly reading. So if you hadn't had a chance to read it, maybe after the talk would be a good time. And I've also shared his recent book, which is available as a PDF freely online, which is called Pluriverse, which is a dictionary of the various alternatives that are out there. So with that, I'll pass it on to Ashish, to talk to us. Thanks, Ashish.
Thanks, Vishnu. Happy to be here. Nice to be able to join from such a distance. I wish I could be physically there with you all.
Yeah,
I don't know if the background I'm seeing with you is a screen image or that's not the actual background, right?
No, it's a very good screen image.
Okay, yeah, I would have been very jealous.
Yeah, no.
Hello everybody, and like I said, I'm happy to be here. So I will make a presentation for about 20-25 minutes. Is that okay? And then we
Yeah.
can open it up for questions. All right, so let's get straight into that. So I've kind of moved, I wouldn't say away from, but into a much wider field than what I used to work in. I did a lot of work on biodiversity policy, protected area governance and management, like Vishnu said. But in the last few years, especially the last decade or so, I've been trying to focus much more on looking at the larger issues of development and political governance and the nature of the economy and so on. Because unless one does that, there is no way in which we can think about protecting wildlife and biodiversity and the environment. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Just a few slides in the beginning on what I call the bad news, and then I'll try and look at the kind of alternative living, thinking, being, doing that people are trying to conceive of in different parts of the world, and what are the kind of frameworks emerging from that. And as many of you may have been reading, there's a lot of buzz around the Green New Deals that have emerged in the US and in England and Europe. And now there's some talk about a global Green New Deal. I think some of these are quite amazing initiatives, but they also have some fundamental problems. And I prefer to look at it in terms of the multiple colors of transformation and revolution that we need, and therefore more of a rainbow transformation. And I'll explain that as I go now. So I should make this full screen. Right, so quickly, and this is something we can have more discussion on if somebody wants to do that, is that in the last few decades, what we've seen in terms of development, especially globalized development, and with its very, very singular focus on economic growth as the main means and indicator of what we think of as development, we've seen it's been enormously violent towards the rest of nature, like the image that you see here. And also, of course, communities who are directly dependent on nature, natural ecosystems, natural resources for their survival, their livelihoods, their cultural sustenance, and so on. So in India alone, for instance, we have destroyed something like 30 to 40% of our natural forest cover in the last few decades. Of course, the destruction started in colonial times, but it has continued post-independence. And we have seen some 60 million people being physically thrown out of their lands in the name of development, for mining, for pipelines, for big hydro projects, nuclear projects, etc. And in a very fundamental sense, what this has also meant is a violence against each one of us individually, especially socially, psychologically, spiritually. And we've seen the devastation of very large sectors of livelihoods, especially those in the so-called primary sector, the farming and pastoralism and crafts and fisheries and so on. And the creation of new jobs in the modern sector, some of which are of course exciting and interesting and fun, but most of which are extremely dull, deadening mass production systems. You fit somewhere as a cog in a mass production system with absolutely no control over the final product or the your own creativity. And I call that a process of moving from livelihoods to deadlihoods. And finally, then we have the COVID crisis. The last 7 months has been a massive wake-up call to humanity. Whether we will actually wake up from this or not is still a big question mark. We've seen how states in many parts of the world, including, for instance, in India, have used this as an excuse to become even more authoritarian and corporations to profit from it. I think the top 10 billionaires have gained some $600 billion just in these last 6 months. And but also on the other hand, we've seen a number of movements from very small scale to large scale, which are attempting to argue for and achieve transformations towards justice, equity, sustainability, fairness, solidarity, and so on, moving away from the current system and saying we can't go back to the so-called normal because that was not normal at all. It was extremely unsustainable and unjust. And so the question is whether we can actually move and push much more towards the second path than the first. Um, I think there are two elements to, if we think of what could be alternatives to the currently globalized, modernized system and the current forms of political governance, there are two kinds of responses one can give. One is, of course, movements of resistance, where people are protesting, where they're saying that we don't accept this unjust system, whether it is with regard to capitalism or state domination or patriarchy and masculinity, or in India, casteism, or as we've seen in US and elsewhere, racism, or the human domination over the rest of nature. These are what I call the sort of structures of inequality, of the structures of the concentration of power against which there are movements that are resisting. This image that you see on this slide, for instance, the central image is from a movement from about 30 years back, where uh, there was the indigenous people of central India protested against two large hydro projects which were going to displace them, and they were able to stop those projects. But what was very interesting was that in the process of arguing this, they were talking about the river as their mother and not as something that could be seen as a source of electricity production, not as a commodity. And so there were two contrasting civilizational worldviews that could be seen in this contestation. But the second crucial part of the alternatives is to construct or sustain radical alternatives in many different, sorry. in many different fields of human endeavor to meet human needs and aspirations without destroying the environment and without creating the kind of inequality and injustice that we're seeing around us. And so, in the last few years, we've been helping to document and sustain many such initiatives in different parts of India. And I'll just maybe profile two or three of them, and I'll also tell you a website later on, in which there are about 1,500 such stories. So quickly, a couple of them. One that has been enormously inspirational for me, which I've been dealing with or relating to, going to in the last 20, 25 years, is this group of about 4.5, 5,000 Dalit women farmers. Those of you who know the Indian caste system will recognize that as Dalits. They are the most oppressed caste. If you had heard about the recent horrific gang rape and murder of a woman in northern India. She was a Dalit woman, and that has been their the oppression has been around for a few centuries now. Also, as women, they are oppressed in a patriarchal system. So, in the last 30 years or so, these women have formed committees or sanghas, as they call them, in every village, in about 75 villages, and they have brought back their traditional varieties of grains, and they have taken complete control over everything to do with food, that is the seeds, the land, the water, the knowledge, and so on, and collectivized a lot of their operations. And through all of that, they have actually created not just food security from a situation in which they were facing hunger and deprivation and poverty 30 years back. They're now completely secure with their food, but they're also sovereign with regard to their food. And that's a very important movement towards autonomy. They, in fact, are now doing so well and completely organic, completely ecologically sustainable, all local seeds, nothing, no dependence on the outside world. They're so successful that in the COVID times, they were able to contribute food grains and forage and so on for the relief work in the last few months. A second example is from central India. This is an indigenous population, Adivasis as we call them in India, and again very severely disprivileged in mainstream society because Adivasis or indigenous peoples are minorities in India. But here in central India, they have a very large population. It's predominantly indigenous. And what they've done in the last few years is reclaimed their community or collective control over forests, which are their main source of livelihood, and stopped mining proposals by the government, but also asserted their cultural identity, also realized that internally they can also be gender iniquitous. So, creating systems by which the women have a much greater confidence to also express themselves in decision making. And through all of that, basically assert that as indigenous peoples in India, they have a right to a centralized right to decision making. And this is also based on a 25, 30-year-old notion of self rule or self determination, something similar to what, say, the Aboriginal indigenous people of Australia have been asking for, or Canada, or Latin America, or wherever, and saying that a slogan that one of their villages has is that while we elect the government in New Delhi, in our village, we are the government. Now, ordinarily, if I had much longer time, I would have given you many more examples, including from cities in India. But given lack of time, I just want to quickly move to looking at a couple of examples from outside India, from other parts of the world. So this book that, this book that Vishnu mentioned, Pluriverse, has 100 examples of such radical or systemic alternatives from different parts of the world. Some are small, maybe a few villages or a few one town or something. Some are very large, such as the Kurdish Rojava movement, which I'll talk about in a minute, or the Zapatista movement in Mexico, and others. And what they all provide to us is very interesting pathways of trying to deal with the kind of crises that we are in. Oh, this map also, by the way, I love. probably some of you are familiar with it, but at least in India, when I show it, everybody says, "Why is it upside down?" And I think it's a very decolonizing map, because you begin to realize that the map that we are used to, the so-called normal map, is actually a colonial time map when Europe used to rule the world and wanted to show itself as being on top and much larger than it actually is. This is the actual sizes of the continents. I love this map. A couple of examples from other parts of the world to illustrate the framework. One, I was lucky to actually be able to go here last year to the Sapara territory in Ecuador's Amazon. And here they have been struggling to protect their entire territory, especially from oil and other mining explorations, so far successfully. But they're also been trying to develop hybrid systems of economy, which retain their own spiritual and cultural ways of living with and within the forest, but also have elements of ecotourism or community-based tourism, where people from outside can come and experience the way they live, their worldviews, their economy, their politics, and so on. It's a very, very interesting attempt at trying to uh, live within the modern context, but in a way that is culturally and ecologically rooted. The second example is from Central and Western Asia, which is Kurdistan, which is sort of in the midst of possibly the most war-torn area of the world, which is the Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey border. And the Kurdish people have always been persecuted in all of these countries. And in the last few decades, they've been struggling to try and create their own autonomous region, at least in some parts very successfully, based on eco-feminist and radical democracy principles. You have to remember that this is also an intensely patriarchal society and very, very militarized. So it's not an easy thing to do, but the women have been leading this and also trying to practice what they call genealogy, which is sort of a eco-feminist ideology that they have been propagating. So it's a fascinating experiment at trying to create a zone of peace within an area or a region of conflict. And you can find something similar, some similar things happening in some cities of the world where what they call feminization of politics, which is to say make politics itself much less hostile and competitive, much more collaborative, and also creating cities or transforming cities into what they call fearless areas where refugees or those who are marginalized or women can feel very, very safe. So winding up with the kind of framework that emerges from these sorts of examples from different parts of the world um, is a model that we, my co-author Asim Srivastava and I, in the book that Vishnu showed called Radical Ecological Democracy, and we've been trying to work on it and develop in the last few years. It's a very simple concept. It basically means that wherever we are part of decision making in whatever kind of collectives or institutions we are. If we are in a village or in a town neighborhood or in an educational institution, as students also, we should be part of decision making. We can't leave it to those who we elect or those who are currently in power. That actually is the original meaning of democracy. And when you think about it as a radical form of decision making, radical meaning going to the roots, not sort of killing each other, then it makes eminent sense. And but while we exercise that power wherever we are in collective forms, we are also responsible to others, other human beings, and to the rest of to other species, to the rest of nature. So that's why radical ecological democracy. The notion Swaraj, which you see on the top of the slide there, is a very ancient Indian worldview, which Gandhi brought back during the independence movement. But it wasn't simply about freedom and autonomy of India vis-a-vis the United Kingdom or England, but also a much deeper concept of my individual and my community's freedom and autonomy in responsibility to your freedom and autonomy, which then means self-restraint. It means ethical living. It means being able to limit one's needs and demands and wants, and also be responsible towards all of life. And there are similar concepts in so many different parts of the world. From your part of the world, for instance, the indigenous aboriginal notion of country, from Latin America, many different ones, from Africa, from different parts of the world. There's lots of different notions of well-being, which are about the well-being of all species and about all humans also being able to flourish. And then there are notions that come from within the industrialized countries or the West, and like degrowth and eco-socialism and ecofeminism and so on. And now, like I said, some of the Green New Deals kind of work that is being done. That's the book that Vishnu mentioned, and I can give you a link later on in the chat for where you can download it free if you don't want to buy it. So another way of looking at this is to say that the kind of transformations or changes people are uh, trying out on the ground or arguing for in their worldviews are along 5 different spheres. So very quickly, one sphere on the top right hand side is that of politics. So looking at politics not as something where we go for elections once in 4 years or 5 years, but actually where we exercise power wherever we are in a radical form, and then we make the state, insofar as the state will still exist, make the state accountable. And this also then leads to very interesting notions of what would political boundaries be? Would they be as they are right now, or would they change also to meet ecological and cultural needs? The second important sphere of transformation on the right hand side is economic democracy, which is where instead of the economy being in the control of nation states and capitalist corporations, they would be in our control, which means those of us who are producers have control over our means of production, that instead of privatization, we move towards the commons, that instead of everything being seen from a monetary point of view or a financial point of view, we see it from the point of view of does it really meet our needs of caring and sharing and our basic human needs, etc. The third crucial sphere, given the kind of inequalities that we have, gender, caste, class, racism, etc., is really about the struggles of social justice and equality. The fourth, which is so important, is recognizing that there are multiple forms of knowledge. It's not just modern science and technology, but many, many other forms of knowledge and knowing. And also, of course, a huge diversity of cultures and languages and so on. And that this is all very crucial for our flourishing and for our survival and resilience on Earth. And finally, of course, on the top left-hand side, and maybe this is a fundamental, this is a sort of base for everything else, is the sustenance of the earth itself, of the rest of nature, because without that, we're all dead. Now, at the center of this flower of transformation is what is a set of fundamental ethics or values. And I'm just going to put that out. We don't have the time to discuss it, but maybe if somebody has questions or comments on this. If I was to show you just one slide out of this whole presentation, this would be the one. Because to me, the examples I've given you, the Deccan Development Society or the villages in central India or the Sapara nation in Ecuador or whatever, they are showing us a very different set of values than what the dominant mainstream capitalist state dominated patriarchal society tells us. It's really about, if we take the fourth bullet point, it's about cooperation and not competition. It's about the commons and not about private property. Or if you take all the second last one, it's about living non-violently, and that means many different things, in peace and harmony, and uh, not in hostility with each other. It's about respecting not just human rights but also the rights of the rest of nature. It's about thinking of happiness, not so much about buying more and more and more physical thing or buying the latest iPhone, but actually saying, do we have good social relations? How is my family life? Do I have a have access to natural surrounds, to be able to enjoy nature, etc. Uh, Beyond, of course, that doesn't mean we deprive ourselves of our physical and biological needs, but beyond that. Okay, so just quickly, one of the questions that I often get asked is, this is all fine, but it's too utopian. How do we get there? And of course, none of us have full answers to any of this. We have huge challenges. It's not going to be easy to get there, but there are pathways that people are showing. And I think amongst the important pathways is this combination of the two elements I mentioned, resistance and construction of alternatives, or in India called Nirman and Sangharsha and Nirman. And also that, to me, who will lead the way is a very important question. And I think it's really the marginalized, those who have been on the margins, those who have been oppressed and exploited, are the ones whose struggles we should be supporting and in a way accepting their leadership. And I would say that across the world now, the movements of the youth are extremely important. And I'm quite hopeful that they will help us to emerge from these crises. These are climate movements, social justice movements, so many different kinds of anti-racism movements, etc. We also need to look at the relationships between the very local to the global. How do we, for instance, if we argue for radical democracy, what does it mean for global governance? Are questions that we have to address. And the last point I think is as important, that even as we try and practice this, even as we try and show that it's possible on the ground, we also have to be envisioning the future, maybe creating utopias, creating dreams, and trying to move there. So, in an attempt to try and help to do this across the world, we've created last year a global sort of a platform or a process called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, trying to weave together the radical movements in different parts of the world, have more dialogue, create more collaborations, learn from each other, and become more of a critical mass for transformation. These are some of the websites. Oh, I forgot to put. Oh yeah, the first website on the top is the one which has the about 1,500 stories from India. The second website is more global, for examples from other parts of the world. And with that, I think I'm done. Yes. Okay, Vishnu, that's it. Thanks a lot. I
Thank you.
hope that was on time.
No, that was fine, Ashish. Thank you very much. And if you, are you happy to stay back and take some questions? And
Yes, of
yeah,
course.
okay,
Yes.
yeah. So maybe I'll start off, and then we'll see if there are any from students. Is just in your perspective, which is quite unique, given that you've been involved in all of this for over 40 years. Um, can you think of 2 or 3 things that has worked as an enabler over all these years?
Yes. I think I think the civil society movement has been an enormous enabler, um, because governments across the world. I mean, of course, you have sometimes good governance in terms of welfare programs and sometimes progressive policies and things like that. But by and large, governments have tended towards economic policies and political systems which are centralized and creating the kind of problems that we've seen,
Mm,
and also failing in meeting things like especially global governance and things like
mm,
climate, etc., as we know. But so therefore the rise of the civil society movement, and by civil society movement I mean more those who are really grounded, and those especially who are emerging from the marginalized section, but also middle class, but not the professional NGO kind of type, because that has just become another uh, career option. Yeah. But I think the civil society movement has been enormously influential in resisting the domination of states and capitalists and so on, but also in facilitating transformation amongst communities who have been so badly deprived over 200 years of colonialism or other kinds of domination that they don't necessarily have their own self capacity to emerge
mm,
from it. So that's been, I think, a very important enabler.
Yep.
The second one I would say is the spread of ideas and worldviews which can provide inspiration, which can provide us the impetus to say, oh, yes, that's where we want to go, or yes, we can achieve this. When you hear stories of transformation from other
Mm,
parts of the world, which are embedded in worldviews that are so very different, and then
mm,
you realize that you can go deeper into your own culture and find also similar kinds of notions and worldviews, then
mm.
that also becomes a very important enabler. So at least these two, but I can think of many more. But these are two
Yep.
very important ones.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. I was asking because I know students are working on their essays now with different topics. So for them to think about, okay, so given my issue, what can I learn from these things that are happening around the world, and look at more closely as something that we could pursue in our examples. Yeah. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna now turn to students to see if there are any comments or questions.
I have a question, if that's okay.
Sure, Kerry. Yep.
I know that that was really wonderful and interesting. Thank you, Ashish. I should say that
Thank you.
first. Um, I know that you've touched on this when you talk about the values and relating back to what Vishnu has just asked about what actually works. On the projects that you personally have been involved in, involved in, or the communities that you've been on the ground with, can you also identify, is there anything else, like is there a catalyst or a specific kind of person or mentality or something within the community that makes these projects become a groundswell movement that actually has an effect?
Sure. Yeah, I think what we've seen, there's some kind of common patterns, though there are, of course, there's a lot of uniqueness also in a number of initiatives. So it's not so easy to generalize. But there are some things. I mean, for instance, the role of enlightened leadership is very important. And here, I think it's important to point out that it may not necessarily be a single individual. It could be a group, it could be a collective leadership, a group of women or a group of young people, or whatever. And but the importance of catalyzing the process and sustaining it through its periods of ups and downs. This is very, very important. I think every one of the initiatives I know of, I can think of some of the sort of individuals or the collectives that made it happen because they took the initiative, they sustained it, they were able to overcome challenges or bring in people who could help to overcome challenges. But what I think is very important in this form of leadership, successful leadership, is that they do, to some extent at least, they do what the Zapatista say one of their 10 principles of governance is that the best leader is the one who follows, which means that we're listening to the ground, we're listening to what people's issues and problems are, we're listening to other people's knowledge and wisdom, and acting on the basis of this kind of openness rather than saying, okay, I know what is best and I'm going to do it. And I think that's so. It also means that there's a constant feedback loop happening in the system of governance, which is so missing in our normal conventional governance system. There's always this ability to be able to listen to what's happening, to see what might be going wrong, to look at the opportunities that take up that exist or come up, and use those opportunities, etc. So I think that's one very important component. The kind of leadership that's there, and that also the leadership, and that's maybe a second component, but in a sense related to the first one, is often what happens is that you get a really good leader, but then he or she or they never are able to transmit those qualities or create a second rung of leadership, and then after a generation the process collapses. So the ability to pass down generations in ways that are mentoring, non-threatening, solidarity based, etc., which actually, if you look at it in traditional systems, has happened quite a lot anyway. But in the modern context, it's not so easy. I think that's second very crucial component. How are intergenerational uh, transfers of knowledge, wisdom, power, etc., taking place?
Absolutely. Thank
Um,
you so much.
so these are two. I mean, there are again many. There's, for instance, if you have progressive policies, that can be a very important element also of transformation. Many countries have progressive policies, or at the international level, you have global agreements or treaties which are important, like say the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and those can become tools also of transformation if there are people at the ground level who know how to use those tools. Yeah, we have a document, and I can send Vishnu a link to that later, where we've looked at I think 140 examples of community-led conservation in India, and looked at the principle, sorry, the lessons from that in terms of leadership, catalysis, what has really worked on the ground and what has not. So, what are the common trends emerging from that? I can, Vishnu, I can send you that link.
Yeah,
It's on our website.
yeah, thanks, Ashish. Yeah. I've got a question on the chat window there, and that relates to one of the principles you noted, which is on simple living. And the question is, and we had a bit of a discussion on this in our unit as well, that could be a really important transformative opportunity for us to be happy, but still avoid overconsumption and the issues associated with that. So the question is, given the value of simple living and the benefits it's provided for people who have taken it up, what are still the barriers for getting it a broader audience in India, for example?
Well, I think the the biggest barrier is a cultural and psychological one created by an enormously powerful advertising industry, backed by the most powerful corporations in the world.
Mm,
And we're all prone to this, whether we're on any of the social media pages, or we watch television, or we see anything being streamed from Netflix or whatever. Virtually any medium that we are looking at has advertising embedded in it, much more so today than it ever was, maybe even 10 years, 20 years, 15 years, 20 years back. Um, and so it's playing on us all the time, psychologically, culturally, it's playing on us right from the time we're 1 year old or 2 years old. And this is obviously a huge challenge to overcome. How do we actually tackle an industry that has more money than some of the the national budgets of many of the countries? um, and I think, I mean, this is not the only thing. There are, of course, a number of others. There's also the whole element of how, because of the same process of development and governance and so on, there's such enormous psychological and social and cultural insecurities that are created in our lives, that we want an outlet, we want something, and then that becomes again going shopping, or logging on to any of these channels, etc., and basically enabling that much more profit making by these corporations. We've seen that in the last 7 months, especially. There's so much psychological impact of the COVID crisis. People having, being stuck at home, worrying about health, etc., etc. That the biggest profit makers are Amazon and Google and so on, because we're all, indulging in that, or having to indulge in that. Anyway, so those are the challenges. But to my mind, there's a number of things that can be done to respond to these. None of them easy, but they are being done to some extent, and more needs to be done. I've written an article, I can send you that, called uh, "Why Don't We Have a Sustainable Consumption Line?" So, like in India and many other parts of the world, we have what's called a poverty line. That is to say, a basic minimum line, and no human being should be below that. So, it's a responsibility of the state to make sure that everybody has that basic minimum of all the basic needs that we need, and people shouldn't be deprived. But I think what we need is that an upper consumption line also, Because if we don't have that, we are actually depriving somebody else from their basic needs as individual consumers or as collective consumers. And so what would that mean? It would mean that as a society, I don't want this to be a government dictated thing. As a society, we have to look at and educate ourselves. What is the impact of my consumption on somebody else or on some other species? Most of us are not even aware of that. When we go and buy something in the supermarket, we don't actually know what the impact is. Recently, I saw a video of Apple products, about Apple products. The Apple products together are having an impact, social or ecological impact, in 40 countries. There's, like, for instance, if you look at your iPhone, the kind of minerals that go into the making of that, including, for instance, to make it touch sensitive, to have the kind of screen that you have, etc., is has components of mining in at least 10 different countries of the world, which is displacing local communities or destroying the local environment. Most iPhone buyers will not actually be aware of that. Now, I'm pointing to iPhone not because I hate Apple. I'm actually using a Mac right now, but just as an example, and you can see this with any product, any digital product. So educate ourselves and educate others as to what is the impact. Now, for instance, we have on cigarette packets, we have this thing about how it could, cause cancer and destroy your life. Let's start putting that kind of stuff in every such product, saying, okay, this has been mined from Congo, where it has displaced X number of people. Let's demand that. Okay, so it's just being honest, right? Okay, then you still have a choice whether you buy it or not. But I would imagine that at least half of the people will hesitate a bit, and some of them will say, oh, I don't want to buy this if this is what it's causing. That's one. Secondly, then creating a culture of understanding that we can actually live happily and well with less, and not the culture of happiness being more and more and more and more. And it's this thing of more and more is actually a couple of generations old. It's not that old. I remember when I was growing up and when I was in school, we used to use our pencils till they were like, this small. And we would be frowned upon by parents and teachers if we threw away something that was this much. Right? And we called it a Gandhi pencil, by the way, because he had also said that, live simply, use everything to its maximum potential. That's just 2 generations back. Today, it's completely the other way around. It's a throwaway culture. But why can't we actually transform it back again into saying that, in fact, that's the high status way of living? Take cycling in Europe. It's now, it's so common that politicians are using it, prime ministers are using it, people in three-piece suits, businessmen in three-piece suits are using cycles. How has that changed? I'm not suggesting we copy Europe for everything. Most of what's happening there is horrible. But these are changes that are taking place where especially the youth are in fact taking a lead, saying, actually, it's fashionable. I don't mean superficial fashion, but that it is the way to do is to cycle rather than use a car. So I think we need role models who can actually help us to do this. I don't mean famous actors and so on. It could be any of us who actually do it and show the world that this is possible. And we need, finally, and this is where government policy is important, we need to push for policies for what's it called, upper limits to salaries. That's one of the biggest issues with regard to consumption patterns. Upper limits to salaries with regard to what is permissible. Sorry, this answer has become too long, but our forest dwelling communities in India have a limit that they can only, for instance, if they want to rebuild their house, they can only cut one tree in a year or in 5 years or whatever. There's something like that. Okay, that's imposed by the government. So I'm saying, if you can do that with poor communities in a forest, why can't you impose a limit on households like mine to say, this is the only amount of water you'll get, this is the only amount of electricity you'll get. You cannot have, okay, between 10 families, you can have one car. Otherwise, use the public transportation system, and of course, then make the government accountable to having a good public transportation system, etc. So I think we need to move in these many different directions and empower the communities from whom we are stealing the resources. So if the communities in central India, those 90 villages, are now saying no mining in our territory, somewhere somebody is going to get the message saying that my consumptive living of marble and iron and whatever is no longer possible because the villages who will be displaced are saying no. And that's going to hit me at some point as an urban consumer and say, oh, this means I need to also look at my own lifestyle. So I think there's multiple different transformations that need to take place.
Yeah.
Some of it is happening with regard to plastic, with regard to some of the things that are so glaringly destructive now to so many people.
Thanks, Ashish. I think that's useful. I think part of the key takeaway is that I mean, we've got to look at it from multiple perspectives, and that's also the value of having all the students here. They'll all go and end up doing work in various fields, and it's a matter of trying to integrate all of that and achieve scale. And and I think it seems challenging given we're running out of time all the time. It seems challenging as to understand whether we will achieve that scale, but I think we can't know to some extent. We've just got to keep pushing it, and hopefully that property will emerge in the future sooner than later. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Yeah. So well, thank you, Ashish, and I don't want to keep you for any longer, so thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Maybe just one final thing is to say that,
Sure.
one of the quotes we've used in, I think, even Pluriverse or the book before that, Alternative Futures, is from a Argentinian film director called Borini, which was quoted by Eduardo Gudinas, the famous, Galeano, the famous poet and author from Latin America, which is about utopia. And he says, if I see utopia on the horizon, it's always too far. If I walk 10 steps towards it, it walks 10 steps further. I walk another 10 steps and it keeps walking further. So I can never reach it. So what's the point of utopia? And he says that's precisely the point. I'm walking and I'm walking in a certain direction I want to. So I'm at least getting somewhere. Whereas if we don't have utopian thinking, if we don't have visions of what's ideal in our minds, and actually all of us in some way or the other have these embedded, we don't necessarily make it explicit, then we're stuck and we'll never move. And I think it's very important to learn from movements in history that have done this and succeeded. Anti-colonial movements, movements of indigenous peoples to claim to reclaim their territorial rights and self-determination in different parts of the world. The women's rights movement. This is so important. We don't realize it. Of course, patriarchy is still very strong, but in the last 100 years, there's been enormous change in the way women can hold their heads high and be able to voice themselves as equals. And this started with a few women basically saying, sorry, we don't accept inequality, we don't accept patriarchy. At that point in time, if we had this seminar and somebody had asked this question, oh, okay, but it's impossible. Patriarchy is a 5,000-year-old system. How are a few women going to change it? That skepticism is, of course, in us, and it's important, but we need to understand that everything starts with a few people, and that very large transformations can and have taken place.
Yep, definitely. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I think that's one of the central messages that Noam Chomsky says as well. Is he says, we could have never imagined a democracy when we had feudalism, but it did happen, and it's better than feudalism. And another system, we are imagining it and we're moving towards it. We don't quite know what it looks like. It might look differently for different parts of the world, but I think it's important for us to share ideas such as this, equip ourselves, and help make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just typing out the link for the book Pluriverse.
I've put that in our resource material.
Oh,
Ashish.
okay.
Yep. And
Okay. All right.
I'll put that in the resources, and I've asked students to read at least 2 examples from that, but they can read more if they wanted to. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you very much. We're very pleased to have had you, and
thank you.
Thanks,
All the best
Ashish.
for the rest
Yep.
of the.
And if others could join me, and there are chat messages coming through, I hope you can see it. So yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Vishnu, I also sent you the much longer presentation, right? The link to the longer presentation,
Yes,
if
yeah,
anybody's interested. Yeah,
yep,
okay.
yeah. Now I'll put that on our online resource where they've got other presentations. I've also put a link to your plenary that you gave at the Sustainable Production Consumption Conference a few years ago in China somewhere.
Oh yeah, that was long back.
Yeah.
Things have evolved since then, so I can maybe send you a couple of others. So the political economy, the political ecology conference 3-4 years back. Maybe the
Okay.
presentation there is more
Yeah.
up to date.
Yeah,
I'll send you.
I quite like that because there's one part of that on sustainable consumption and another part
Yeah.
on the questions were also interesting. The questions that you got in the end, which is questions that we would have probably asked you ourselves, but that's a useful
Okay, well,
good,
I'm
good
glad
resource.
some things I say might be of use.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, Andres, you got your hand up. Is there a question or?
Yes. Hi, Ashish. How are you? Thank you so much for your
Hi.
presentation. I noticed that you wrote a book with Arturo Escobar. He's also from Colombia. He's a great mind, I have to say. And I just wanted to ask a question, which is how does radical ecological democracy work within highly divided societies? And this question is really important for me to know because, political and cultural scenarios are very different across the world. So you have societies that are highly divided. It is more difficult to enact change within them. So yeah, I was wondering, what are your opinions on that matter?
Yeah. Very important question. And of course, it's hard to give a general answer because, like you said, situations are very different in different parts of the world. But I think one of the lessons we've learned from history is the importance of forums of dialogue, where the different sides who are bitterly opposed to each other, maybe even violently opposed to each other, can feel safe. So often it requires a third party to create that forum of dialogue, and to then be able to work through, first of all, break through the kind of stereotypes that we have of each other. In India, for instance, right now, there's an attempt to try and create forums of dialogue between Hindus and Muslims because there's so much stereotypes. Muslims think of Hindus as 1, 2, 3, and Hindus think of Muslims as 1, 2, 3. And neither has actually gone deeper into the culture to understand what it really is. And one could apply the same thing with, say, indigenous peoples and non-indigenous peoples in your part of the world, or even between two indigenous peoples. And so those forums of dialogue are, they can be created by leadership from within the same communities, or it could be, like I said, third party created. And we have seen that happening in many parts of the world. I mean, if you take, for instance, Europe, World War II, they were killing each other in tens of thousands uh, in so many ways. And post World War II created the European Union, which has meant that uh, not just are they not killing each other, but you can actually travel from one part of Europe to any other part without a visa as a European. That doesn't mean all their problems have been solved and there isn't tension and so on. Of course there is, but compared to what it was at the time of World War II when millions were being killed, it's a huge, massive change. Similar things have happened in other parts of the world. So I think that, to my mind, would be the most important thing. Secondly, to recognize that, see, why do conflicts and wars happen? There are many different reasons, but one of them, for instance, also is the need or the desire to take over somebody's territory or take their resources. Could be oil, could be minerals, could be forests, could be what land. And so the more we actually argue for self-reliant, self-sufficient economies and societies, which then also build in notions of simple living, etc., the less the desire to have to go and or the need to have to go and take somebody else's resources. So at least one major element of conflict would then be reduced. There are many other elements, and again, maybe another interesting example of where that has worked is the Kurdish Rojava movement. I think you should take a look at that. There's a lot of literature available on how they have tried to create a zone of peace in an intensely, as I said, war-torn area. Now, the Kurdish autonomous region is very interesting because it doesn't have only the Kurdish ethnicity. It also has at least half a dozen other ethnic communities. And often they have actually been at loggerheads with each other. But the Kurdish leadership has tried very hard to create a zone of safety and security for every ethnic community. They've tried to make sure that even though they are dominant and a majority, the decision-making forums are accessible to all the ethnic communities. There is a representation from all the ethnic communities. So this has created a form of dialogue and trust which did not exist before this, which has then enabled much less conflict situation within the Kurdish area. Of course, they're still facing military aggression by Turkey and so on. But so I think this is really what we need. We need that kind of leadership. Or even if you take, sorry, the last example I'll give, then I'll shut up. If you take South Africa, now when South Africa gained independence from the brutal apartheid regime that was there before that, Nelson Mandela, so there was a lot of, there was so much anger built up in the community over decades and centuries that they said we have to hit back at the whites. And it was Mandela who said, no, if we move into independence, we have to move into independence in a non-violent way, which means we should have forums of redressal. We should have forums of trying to rebuild harmony and peace in society, along with the whites who are still in the country, along with the settlers or the people. Now, to me, that in a way, a very Gandhian approach uh, created at least it stopped what could have been an enormous era of bloodshed and revenge and so on. Of course, South Africa is going through all kinds of other problems, but that at least was stopped because of the kind of vision that was shown by a great leader, saying that we cannot move ahead with a eye to eye kind of an approach. This is what Gandhi said: if you have an eye for an eye approach, then the whole world will go blind. He had these amazing little uh, one sentences which could say everything. So it's really, I think, about creating those forums of dialogue and uh, understanding that there is some fundamental common goals that we all have, which would work much better if we work together rather than against each other.
Mhm. We have a political leader here, Ashish, and one of the things that he said all his life was the role of democracy is to provide a safe space for dissent.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always admired that, and yeah, and it's a similar principle, isn't it? As long as
Yeah.
you find a means of, and that's what democracy was meant to do, and to varying extents it doesn't, and that hence
Yeah.
we have issues. Yeah.
And that's why the notion of pluriverse is so important, because we accept then that that it's legitimate for there to be a diversity of views, a diversity of ways of living, a diversity of ecologies, qualities, etc., but in ways that don't impinge on somebody else's
Mm.
uh, culture and ideology and so on. So this is why Swaraj, which I mentioned, is so important, because it is about my autonomy and my identity and so on, and that's unique and that's important. But if I push that to destroy your autonomy and your identity, then that's not acceptable. So it is, I think that notion also is very important. And Sadhana's point in the chat about desire of power, I think another very interesting part, and I think it was Hannah Arendt or somebody who wrote about this, that you can think of power in two ways. There's power over, which means there's power of domination, power to subjugate, etc. And there's power with, or power to, which means the power to create a better society, the power to work with others. And I remember somebody, a forest officer in South India, telling me this. This is when I was working on more inclusive forms of conservation. And he was one of these people who was also very much trying to bring local indigenous communities into the forest, into the protected area management system. And I said, aren't you afraid of losing power? Because that's what normally the forest department tells me. And he says, no, when I share power, I actually am more powerful because I can transform things and protect the forest even better. So it's two different notions of power, which I think are very, very important to understand. And real democracy is about power with and power to rather than power over.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good note to close the session. Thanks, Ashish. Thanks again. And
Thank you.
yeah, all the best with the work, and we'll be in touch.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
And thanks others for the questions and staying back this afternoon. So that's it for today. I'll be in touch with some dates to discuss your essays a bit more. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Take care.